Hi. We move into 1 Samuel 26 today, the paired chapter with 1 Samuel 24, as you can see on the right side of the screen. If you haven't been watching the videos for this section, I'd really encourage you to go back and watch the introductory video to 1 Samuel 24 to 26, which shows some of the theories that scholars have of how these three chapters fit together and how that happened to be. And I'm certainly convinced at this point that although I don't usually use source analysis throughout the books of Samuel to try to argue about which parts came from which time period and how some editors edited them all into the form we have now, while acknowledging that that is certainly the case, that it was not all formed completely as we have it right at the beginning. I don't usually do that, but these three chapters plainly fit together as a unit, and as I've been trying to show through the videos on chapters 24 and 25, often use vocabulary that's from later periods, from the post-exilic period, texts that are words that are common to texts like Proverbs and Job and other post-exilic texts like that. So there's a number of factors, in addition to how tightly these three chapters fit together, to suggest that they were inserted later, probably from the exilic time period, around the very question of, is a monarchy what the people should go to when the exile's over? As we can see right now from the green part at the top that highlights 23:19 and then 26:1 almost verbatim, that seems to be the stitch that some editor put in to connect where we are now in 26 with where we were before chapter 24 began. So you could make just one of those verses and then you could continue in chapter 26, but you could also just continue into chapter 27 from the end of chapter 23 and not feel like that much was missing. But regardless, this is how we have it now. And so as the story unfolds in chapter 26, repeating what we heard at the end of 23 and then following, as you can see, many of the parallels between chapter 24 and 25, it seems to completely omit the narrative context of what happened in chapter 25, where David confronted Nabal's people after Nabal refused to provide for David and his men after they had taken care of Nabal's sheep and goats. And Nabal's wife Abigail came down and placated David, and David ended up walking away with Abigail as his wife after Nabal dropped dead of a heart attack and died some 10 days later. So at the end of that, which we've seen throughout, represented a symbolic or perhaps even allegorical or even maybe a dream version of the struggle between David and Saul, highlighting that the question that David has been faced with, which is how will Saul be removed as an obstacle on David's path to the monarchy, to becoming what Samuel made him, which is Yahweh's anointed, that it wouldn't happen through David's sword, but it would happen through the direct act of Yahweh. And so we saw that in chapter 25 in Abigail's speech, and also that David ended up committing no violence at all in that chapter, despite having 400 armed men. So now we return to the story as if that hadn't happened, as if the fight between Saul and David were continuing. And even if we didn't have chapter 25, at the end of chapter 24, which you probably can't read the small print, but I can make it bigger for this immediate purpose. At the end, Saul has David swear to me, therefore by Yahweh, you will not cut off my descendants from me, and that you will not wipe out my name from my father's household. And he swore this to Saul. And so in that context, we think they've reached some kind of peace. And yet the Ziphites come to Saul at Gibeah and say David is hiding, and he rises to chase him. So it makes almost no sense of the narrative context, and it really is in many ways a duplicate of chapter 24, but it's also different. So we're going to focus on the differences and kind of skip over in the videos on this chapter elements that are also covered in chapter 24 that are the same here, both linguistically and thematically. So as you look at this, I also want to show what I've been showing all along, is the connections between chapter 25 and 24 and 6. I mostly put connections from chapter 24, although there are some from 26 here. And as I prepared for this round of videos, I see there are more details I could have put in some of those connections, but this was enough to fill a page. So we'll see more of those as we go. In terms of the key words in this chapter, I wanted to compare the key words we see in 24, which you see here, and those we see in 26. So we can see that although the stories are similar, as we can see here, the parts that are in common are the color-coded parts. Here we'll be able to see, if not side by side, at least if you can hold this one in your mind, or you can download it from radicalbible.net yourself and put them side by side in your own time. But we see the corner of your cloak was a key theme there, and the repeated thing of after, as you see, and then Yahweh is an explanation there. But in 26, the theme is not the corner of the cloak. The theme is the water jar and the spear that David take as symbols from Saul. So we see the spear a number of times, and we see the water jar a number of times. Also, the scene in chapter 24 takes place in a cave where Saul has gone to relieve himself. We hear at the beginning here, and David and his men are already in the cave, and so the men of David say, "Behold, the day of Yahweh, I have given your enemy in your hand." But in chapter 26, David only finds out where Saul is and sends out spies, as we see here. And so he comes to him and finds them sleeping in a circle with Saul at the center and his men surrounding him. And the confrontation won't take place near the mouth of the cave, but David calling from the side of a hill, as we see down here. So the situation is different, but the basic theological themes are very similar, as we'll see as we go through. So in this first part, there aren't really a lot of key words. It's just the setup part, and that's what we'll do today. When we get to this part, we'll see that I've structured this into a nice chiasm here from chapter 7 to verse 12. So we'll look at that in the next video. So jumping right in, I don't need to go over this in much detail, this first verse, because we can see it's virtually identical. It's just a transitional paste here to tie those back together. But starting in verse 2, it's similar here to chapter 24, but not echoing that. So Saul rises as he did here, but notice in 24, it was when Saul returned from following the Philistines. The transition that the writer put in there was that, oops, there's some Philistines, and Saul went after him, and he comes back with no report of the battle at all, simply that Saul went to fight Philistines and then came back and was told David is in the wilderness of En-gedi. So other than the location, which is not particularly important to either of these because they have a conversation that's really independent of the details of the location, we find them here where Saul is told David is hiding on the hill of Hachilah opposite Jeshimon, or opposite the wilderness or the desert. Jeshimon means waste or wilderness, and every other time it's translated as simply as not a proper noun, but as simply as the desert. So on a hill opposite the desert, and Saul rose, and as my note below suggesting, based on the narrative sequence, has Saul completely forgotten their previous encounter, or is this merely redaction? You'll have to decide for yourselves. So he's got the same 3,000 chosen men we saw to seek David in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul encamped on the hill of Hachilah, opposite Jeshimon, beside the road, and we don't need to look at those details here, while David remained in the wilderness. But when he, which is to say David, learned that Saul came after him in the wilderness, and as Falkman notes here, verse 3b fulfills two functions because it is in a transitional position. At the end of the 6 lines about Saul's quest that we've just come through, and also at the beginning of the first 6 lines about David's counterquest. So at the hinge there is when he learned that Saul came after him into the wilderness. And we have to ask, as we always do in these, how does he know? How did he learn? Did he send messengers out? Throughout chapter 25, we saw that he sent his young men to Nabal, and then later we're told he sent servants to Abigail, and it also includes that described as messengers. So here we don't hear how he learned, we just know that he saw, and it's literally that he saw, not that he learned, which implies direct knowledge. So it's more like he could see him, whether that's physically seeing him or just understanding, we're not sure. But learned makes it sound like it's more immediately through somebody else's intermediary, and he may have recognized it himself. Because now he sends out what are described as spies. Regal, that's specifically the word for spies, and we'll see them a number of times. 10 times in Joshua Judges for spying out the land, looking ahead to see whether the towns of the Canaanites were capable of being gone around or of being conquered. So David sent out spies and learned that Saul had indeed arrived, and then set out and came to the place where Saul had encamped. So this is all just to get us there. There's not a lot of details we need to be paying attention to, but I'll note that the slowing down of the action laid out one small step at a time. The writer could have simply said, and David came to the place where Saul was encamped. So given all this detail, why does that matter? It's not obvious why it matters, but I'd like to suggest it's showing that unlike the last situation, which seemed, at least from the men of David's perspective, to be divinely arranged, that what are the chances that Saul would happen to wander into the cave where David's men were. But here, this is not divinely created, this is planned out. Saul is first coming to find out where he thinks David is, and now David is coming to find out where he thinks Saul is, and so they're meeting here just on their own initiative based on the messages they hear. Notice it hasn't given any motivation yet. It hasn't said that Saul is looking at him to kill him or just to confront him, and it doesn't show any intention from David. It just shows them maneuvering their chess pieces, so to speak, in a position before the encounter will happen. So David set out and came to the place, literally, and stood up. A key word in chapter 24, but it's not a key word in chapter 26. One of those examples of how the vocabulary is different. To the place where Saul had encamped. And interesting, place is a key word in this chapter. We'll see place here and a number of times, and we see it at the end as well. When Saul returned to his place, a very vague description, unlike returning to his house or to his town. So David set out and came to the place where Saul had encamped, and David saw the place, notice twice in the verse, where Saul lay. And lay is also a key word here, separate from the word for sleeping. So a lot of aspects of the story highlighting the supine position of Saul and his men here. Last time he was squatted, and this time he's laying. With Abner, son of Ner, the commander of his army, and army is always wrong here. It's literally commander of his, this is commander, but army is always ha'am, the people. There is no word for army here, and that's making it sound like too formal, a hierarchical military arrangement. It's simply the people of Israel, or maybe even the people of Benjamin, we don't know, and Abner is leading those people. We've seen Abner a couple times before. Last we saw him in 20:25 sitting by Saul's side, and we also saw him when David came from Jesse to see the Goliath situation, and Saul asked Abner, "Who is this young man?" And Abner says, "I do not know," which will come out here where they will know. So we already know that Abner has encountered David back in chapter 17, and he was near Saul's side in chapter 20. We note also that the role of commander Sar here, Sar Zebaoth here is the full title here, is something that David had done. Remember, David had killed his thousands, Saul had killed his thousands, and David his tens of thousands, and so Saul had made David, after the Goliath thing, the commander. We didn't ever hear that he was removed from that, but we've known for a while that Abner had that role. So Saul was lying within the encampment, Hama Egalah here, the word only here and back in chapter 17 around the Goliath situation, so only these two places, and elsewhere, to say 2 verses down. While the people was encamped around him, doubled here, emphasizing the troops surrounding Saul. So the word doubled there. So around him, yes, around him, we might say. So we're picturing this, that Saul is lying there, and Abner is with him, and then all these people are surrounding them, encamped around them. We don't know how many. Well, you do know there are 3,000, we were told. So that would be a lot of protection, it would seem. And one of the interesting questions is going to be, how is David going to manage to get past them and not be noticed? But that'll be for next time. So just continuing where we are now. So in verse 6 we hear, and my question is just responding to what we have here. So let's look what we have, and we'll see my note there. David said to Ahimelech the Hittite. Is that the same Ahimelech we saw earlier in chapter 20? That Doeg came and killed him and all the priests of Nob? That Ahimelech was dead, according to that chapter. So we don't know. We don't hear that he's a priest. So this perhaps some other Ahimelech than the one we've seen earlier. He's described as a Hittite, though. This is the first mention of a Hittite, not only in Samuel, but in the entire Deuteronomistic history. But the next one is Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba. And as I was noting in the last video from chapter 25, there were a number of references that brought echoes ahead to the David and Bathsheba and Nathan and David story. And so here this continues with this reference to a Hittite, which will come out earlier. And my note below has Ahimelech, earlier referred to by his father's lineage as the son of Ahitub, which takes him all the way back to the line of Eli at the beginning of the book, but not ethnic geographically. He's only mentioned again in chapter 30, verse 7 as the father of Abiathar, but we thought he was dead, so it must be some other Ahimelech, and that wouldn't be too surprising. There's Ahimelechs and Abimelechs also elsewhere in the Bible. But then we have other names here, and notice how many proper nouns there are in this verse. 7 in particular in this one verse. Joab first mentioned here. So we've seen Abner. This is the first time we're hearing of Joab, and notice it doesn't say that he's parallel to Abner as commander. It will say that in 2 Samuel chapter 2, but we don't know that yet. All we know is that he's somebody with David, and this is the first named person we've heard with David since Jonathan. In chapter 25, we just heard of his 600 men, 400 with swords that came down to confront Nabal, and 200 that stayed with their stuff. But we didn't hear there was any organization between David and the people. But now we hear about Joab, but we again don't hear what his role is. And we don't hear that he does anything. He's just mentioned here, but not an actual character who does anything. So, and to Joab's brother Abishai, which is the point here, Joab's brother Abishai, who's also first appearing here along with Joab. In 2 Samuel, he'll be the chief assassin. And as Bodner notes below, quoting Ackerman, more than any other character, Abishai is depicted as David's alter ego, the consistent voice of his dark side. So to the extent in chapter 25 that we just looked at, that Nabal represented perhaps the dark side of Saul, and David in that story represents also the dark side of David with the desire to strap on the sword and kill, Abishai here will be the person who embodies and expresses both David's more murderous inclinations and embodies them at times when David doesn't, giving David lots of plausible deniability. He is described as the son of Zeruiah here. In Hebrew, this is first, and brother of Joab is second, which is interesting. And as my note below, the verse has 8 proper nouns, an odd piling on amid the chase scene. The phrase son of Zeruiah is 24 times in the Masoretic text, 13 times in 2 Samuel, 3 in Kings, and then 8 in Chronicles, the retelling of it. And oddly here, Zeruiah is a woman. Usually the son of, like son of Ahitub for the other Ahimelech, is the father, and that's the general way of doing it. But this is the mother, and we don't know anything about who the father might be, which is very unusual. But curiously, 1 Chronicles presents her as David's sister. There's nothing like that in Samuel, so we can't read Samuel that way, even though a number of scholars want to import that back in. But that violates a couple of elements, both the fact that Chronicles is almost certainly written later, and Chronicles has a very different purpose in its narration than what we have in Samuel. Its whole purpose is around focusing on Solomon built the temple, and the text goes from creation in Genesis all the way to the temple, like that's the pinnacle of the whole purpose. Whereas in the Deuteronomistic history, it's not like that at all. It tells the whole monarchy story, and then at the end suggests the question of was this a mistake or not. But in Chronicles, the monarchy is just there as a vehicle to get the temple built. So he says to Abishai here, and we know now about his brother and his mother, who will go down with me into the camp with Saul? And Abishai said, I will go down with you. And so that sets up our scene for where they go down at night and find that Saul is vulnerable and decide for the second time what they should do with Yahweh's anointed. So we'll get into the exciting scene of that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.